start again. Lecturer of Modern History, okay. It's a tremendous privilege on this rainy Saturday to be in the home of Philip Boobbyer, Lecturer of Modern History at Canterbury...
University of Kent.
University of Kent, Canterbury. And so just for the record, Philip's name was, he was given up for interview by Andrew Sallybras at CO, the Initiatives of Change. And so we've been in dialogue the last couple of weeks and have managed just to have this this moment together. So
yes.
Thank you very much. My questions are around the life of Schumann and,
right.
and the reconstruction of Europe, but particularly these initiatives of reconciliation that go under the radar in the history books, which I know you know lots about. Give us a bit of background about your involvement first of all, because that's important to us.
Okay, so so my parents worked with Bookman. His organisation has been called different things at different times, but it was in the interwar period called the Oxford Group, and then moral rearmament post-war, and then more recently Initiatives of Change.
Yeah.
And so my parents really from the late 40s, early 50s worked with Bookman, and I grew up in that environment.
Ah, right.
And so I've known about it from the inside, and I myself have had an academic career, but also done some academic work on that tradition as well.
Do you want to talk about that just briefly?
Yes. So well, my main area is as a historian of Russia. But more recently, I wrote a book on Frank Bookman's spirituality called The Spiritual Vision of Frank Bookman, which came out in 2013,
right.
Which is really a study of the way he looked at the world and the influences upon him, and how he saw the link, for example, between spirituality and politics.
I would like to break in there then. We said we'd look at that briefly, but why don't we just jump in there, because we're on it. We might not come back to it. Because he was obviously criticised at the time in evangelical circles for meddling, for his meetings with Himmler. I remember a beautiful quote. He said he was so careless of his own reputation. And this crossover between the sacred and the secular, what kind of points were you bringing out in that 2013 book?
Yeah, so Bookman's early influences were particularly from the American YMCA, Keswick movement. He had kind of quite a traditional evangelical training, and but also the kind of Christian circles he was part of were very global in their interests in the sort of pre and post First World War world.
Yes.
And suddenly the world was becoming a more interconnected whole.
Yeah.
So it was not unusual for people to try to expand beyond their own traditions and to learn about others. And Bookman reflected that. But I think his own experience of conversion, change, led him to believe that, if you like, that sort of turning points of the spirit, if you like, inside a person have a kind of social and national impact as well as a purely personal one.
Yeah.
And he saw that from his own experience. And he came to believe that if there was a sort of real change in the heart of a person, it could have, much wider repercussions.
Yeah. And
he wanted to create a framework where that could happen. And so he was already doing that in the 30s, particularly in Northern Europe, but also in South Africa, North America.
Was it China as well by then?
In China, he'd been trying to do that at the end of the First World War. So he had a lot of experience at trying to try to think strategically as a Christian. That the Holy Spirit, he would say, is, if you're really in tune with the Holy Spirit, he can lead you into the heart of a complex situation to enable something new and fresh to happen.
Which is pretty much a living proof of that.
Proof of that, that's right.
It's extraordinary. So he has this sort of apostolic zeal to pioneer, and this sort of American New World entrepreneurialism, which
exactly.
is, I'm sure it would be very distasteful to a more pietistic church leaders who are maybe entrenched in this. But to me, it's such a he sort of comes from the side, out of nowhere almost, into this to have such an impact at such a crucial time. So we were talking about his spirituality. He's unusual. Is there any formative point in his life? I know we've talked in this film, the book, about the Keswick experience, where we know where that is. It's just down the road from us in this little chapel. Is there something? I still don't get how he managed to marry these two worlds, to extend his evangelicalism into the political sphere. What was there some influence on him that made him link these two, where a lot of others have never done so, not even now?
I don't think there's probably one experience. I think it's a series of experiences, and Keswick is one of an important series. Another important moment is his turn to what in evangelical circles is not unusual, but the morning quiet time as a sort of daily practice.
Yeah.
And the famous Baptist minister F.B. Meyer saying, do you give time to the Holy Spirit to direct you?
Yes.
That was about 4 years after the Keswick experience.
Yeah.
Because he was, and even later, he was something of an activist.
Yeah.
And he felt he was doing masses of things, but people weren't really changing.
Yeah.
So that was an important step. Then going to Asia with the YMCA, 1915, meeting Gandhi, going to Japan. I think it really expanded his world, and then returning to post-war Europe in a really complex, unhappy situation. His life had made him start to think, how do I bring these spiritual insights into difficult political situations? So I would say it's a series of experiences rather than one.
Right. Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely correct. It's this sort of American can-do attitude that he brings to that.
Yeah. Is there any way we can quantify, let's say, moral rearmaments effect in reconciliation after the war? Is there any way we can say, these would have been a lot slower, this would never have happened? Or I'm thinking about the meetings of Schumann, trying to get Schumann and Adenauer together, particularly it was almost frustrated, I felt, because there was a number of, is there anything you've read that you could bring a bit of light in there?
I think that's a difficult one to answer. Most of the writings about moral rearmament, including my own, but others, touch on this problem of quantifying the work of the Spirit.
Yes.
And at certain times, moral rearmament, some people criticize it for overclaiming its success.
Yeah.
And then people have kind of, within the movement at times, have stepped back from that and saying, look, we mustn't overclaim, and it's become a bit overcomplicated. I bring it in another perspective. Quite a lot of modern historians of ideas, historians of science, they often emphasize and go against the kind of lone inventor or lone genius idea.
Yeah.
But behind any kind of discovery or step forward, there's always a network.
Yeah. And
I think that Bookman was very good at creating a network. And a network of relationships between people at senior level, between Germany and France. That can be established. There's no question that he did do that, and contributed to that network and helped to create that network.
Yeah.
And there were many people working on the origins of the European community and union, sometimes with quite different concepts of it. Bookman didn't have a political concept for it as such. I don't think that Bookman had a formal political position, but he did have the belief that creating the right kind of network, a network of trust, with ideally a sort of a faith element.
Yeah.
Not in every situation, but some people don't quite come from that perspective, but with a faith or spiritual element to give it life. He believes such a network could change things. And no doubt, you look at the historians writing about it, he created such a network.
Yeah, that's right.
That there is a pattern in the history of moral rearmament of such episodes occurring, of bringing people together from different sides, in a probably off the record atmosphere, sometimes with a kind of prayerful environment, and people in a relaxed sense learning to listen to painful stories from the other side, and in such circumstances taking initiatives which do lead to reconciliation. And so, although you can't prove exactly what happened on the European story, it is a pattern and it fits a pattern. And from the point of view of evidence, there's a lot of evidence to say this type of method works.
Yeah, that's right. I'm thinking now, you've sparked my mind to think of, there's this very tense moment over the Tsar issue. And Adenauer, it's when Schumann's own desires are slightly at odds with the governments, and he's and the French make their declaration known that they're going to take the Tsar, they're going to keep hold of it now, and Adenauer called Schumann a lying Alsatian peasant, and the people in the ears of the people from some of these co-people, and they hold this moral accountability. They say, well, is there any way that we could help Mr. Schumann change?
Right.
And of course, Adenauer, who's had this bit of a sort of turnaround, he goes, oh, well, yes, I need to change also. Isn't that great?
Okay.
But just being there to be a mirror to him, rather than just sort of the politics of antithesis, there was this. I thought that was very. But also,
that's right. So the question is thrown back at Adenauer.
Yeah, in a way, so that. And of course, the trust grew, but it was very, it was very, very difficult. I think Monet calls it an atmosphere glacée when they met in Bonn, and he picks them up from the train station and whisks them away in the car. So he was fearing for an assassination attempt on them because the German. Anyway, that's another thing. So, but the strength of people and the strength of friendships. People don't believe that. They sort of believe everything's committees, but if I've seen anything, it is the power of these individual friendships that have made such an extraordinary pact. So anything on that?
Absolutely, and that comes back to I write about this in my book. Bookman's concept of strategy was very much built around developing people. Yeah. So he said this in North Africa in the early 50s in the context of rising nationalism.
Yes.
Our work is to find constructive personalities to build up.
That's interesting.
So you find constructive personalities in a complicated situation, and you develop them.
That's interesting.
You help them develop the right relationships, learn to appreciate people in the other side. Yeah. So you're building. I think he wrote it down. Our aim is to build up constructive personalities everywhere.
That's very good. I mean, King Mohammed
and he thought
says,
of that in a strategic. That was a sort of strategic sense, and then somehow through building up individuals, men and women, something can grow out of that. So the academics talk about his method as being personalistic in its emphasis.
Yes, that's right. Which is a very sort of a Protestant, the idea of individual salvation, and of course it's thoroughly rooted and grounded. But what was that quote? He says, I think when men listen, God speaks, or when men change, nations change. I think it's something that's very much the kernel of it.
Man listens, God speaks. When man obeys, God acts. When men change, nations change.
Yeah, well, that you couldn't put it more succinctly. Yeah. So, and that's a shock to me, frankly.
And then no. When man listens, it starts with the
listening.
Listening to others and listening to God. There's a line between that and nations changing.
Yeah, we'd rather have the nations changing with less taxes, frankly. But actually, there's a sort of build-up. So when Adenauer and Schumann, they talk about building Europe on Christian foundations, was the word they use. But they're under no illusions. They're not building a sort of a church triumphant, any sort of Christendom. Right. Can you help us understand in any way in their minds what they're saying and how that is different from, because these are Roman Catholics with a long history, and of course Adenauer with the Catholic Zentrum Party.
Right.
Who in his relationship with that is very interesting, and his disillusionment in a way, and he wasn't, I think, sad for it to go into demise after the Enabling Acts, because they abolished themselves virtually, and he wouldn't resurrect it. But anything about that, back to that central issue about build a European, what does he mean? What did they mean? What was in their minds? Because I've not been able to fathom this any further sources. You got anything you?
I actually don't know really enough about Schumann and Adenauer's intellectual journey to answer that. I do know Schumann, I think you might have even seen it, but there's a quote from Schumann about the work of moral rearmament, which says, it's quite widely quoted, about building up apostles of reconciliation everywhere and building up people who will be servants of the state. And I think that Schumann then is looking for a principle of service.
Yes.
A service, a sense that to Christianize a country involves people serving the collective.
And it was very much his understanding.
That probably comes out of some bits of Catholic social thought, and perhaps with Adenauer too. I think with both of them, and with coming to Co expands their world, because Co in the late 40s is very and early 50s is very international, and you're suddenly but you're expanding that world in a slightly informal context.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
So your concept of what Christianization means has to be expanded to accommodate all these people.
Yeah, it's very good. That's very good. Yes, I think this idea.
And Adenauer brings his family, of course, to Co, and quite a few of his family and or his sort of network get involved in Co.
Yeah.
I think have you quantified? I think quite a few of the
nine Adenauers came.
And quite a lot of his cabinet came.
Really?
Oh yeah. Quite a few of the Adenauer cabinet. I think more than the French.
Yeah. Yes, that would figure. Of course, being the CDU, they'd have more of a reason.
So, for example, that's Leif Hovelsson's book Out of the Evil Night. He was a Norwegian resistance fighter who was arrested and tortured by the Gestapo in Norway, had a Christian experience in prison, and after the war was part of these teams of MRA people who went out into Germany. And I suppose, this is from a Protestant background. Irene Law comes from a socialist background.
Yeah.
This again is sort of expanding the world. The Catholics and the Protestants and sort of people from a left-wing background and so on. So they're all having to meet.
Yes.
And all of them, their worlds are expanding.
Yes.
And
the wars enabled this.
This is another really interesting thing. Another interesting insight from the MRA tradition is people like Law and Hovelson, who are, if you like, victims of the war, becoming the reconcilers.
Yeah.
So people who've suffered,
become the wounded healers.
They become the healers, and they also come to realise that although they're victims, they're not saints themselves.
Yes, which is a massive part of
that's
process.
Right, exactly. So Hovelson, having been tortured, then in some particular episode in a detention camp, tried to take revenge on one of his torturers, and it sort of sobered him up later to realise that he was also capable in an attitude of vengeance of also doing bad things.
Yes, I think of more recent Gulag Archipelago.
Yes.
He says that it was only
absolutely.
What was the quote? You probably got it more accurate. Only contingent of history that he was the one with the gun.
Relying on prison store, did I come to realise that the line separating good and evil runs not through states or through classes, but through every human heart.
Yes. Yes. Any other view, I think, than that is it's too It's too simple. It's irrelevant because it's not true. You make the other person the evil person, and you become polarized the debate. Yes, I think that's why the kind of Adenauer, I also need to change. Suddenly you're at that pivoting point where, so it's very, it's very powerful.
Yeah.
Can we talk about Russia?
Yeah.
Post-war. So Adenauer defines himself because of the red menace at his gate a lot of the stuff he does is as a binary to hold back. Could you talk about after that time how, I read various things. Is it how close there was some one journalist saying with these soldiers saying, the Russian soldiers saying that they really felt they were going to pluck Germany for communism. Is that, how true is that, would you say? Is it something to quantify, or?
Well, that I couldn't quite tell you. I think that, but I think that Central Western Europe could have gone communist in another, you've got to remember the late 40s is a lot of poverty, a lot of discontent. These reconciliation attempts that Bookman and co were attempting were part of a wider program, if you like, of making democracy work. And where there's a lot of poverty and social conflict, democracy itself comes into question. People question it. Yeah. So things like this type of work, there's a lot of work which MRA did in the coal fields to try to kind of create, another of its strategic things was to try to kind of create industrial harmony. Yeah. There's the wider background of the Marshall Plan. My view as a historian is that history is not programmed to go in one or another direction. No, and what individuals do in a crisis really does matter. Yeah. And that's, I think, a sobering thought for all of us in our life or social situations, that we can make a difference. Yeah. And I think that the Cold War was a real threat to the democracies. I think sometimes one can be oversimplistic, but communism advanced through the Russian occupation of Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe pretty strongly in the late 40s, early 50s.
That's interesting. Could we talk about the East a bit? Because this is more of your specialism, and it's hard for most people to think about Eastern Europe. Is it because we are the Latin West and they are the Greek East? And could you talk about Orthodox perhaps in any way that maybe help us understand our Eastern European neighbours better? Just talk about their formation, cultural and psychological formation.
I've got a couple of things to which perhaps I could say, but one is to pick up on this theme of the impact of the Orthodox world. Of course, in the Russian context, of course, as the conversion of Russia to Christianity, but what was the Eastern version of Christianity in 988. And the whole of the Orthodox world shaped in large part by the Desert Fathers and by the kind of what we might now call Athonite spirituality, the kind of contemplative monastic tradition. And I think that in our Christian world, in our kind of Protestant Catholic world of Western Europe, we have less exposure to that. We don't know these writers, we don't know their insights. We find them a bit obscure, but the countries like Russia, Ukraine, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, we've got a whole chunk of Europe, which is shaped by, if you like, a different Christian culture. And that's Europe too. Yes. It's also been a Europe in the firing line in terms of Europe's confrontation with Islam, with the Ottoman Empire, and with the Persians and so on and so forth. So these are kind of borderlands where, and of course in a place like Syria, for example, even now, you've got strong kind of Orthodox communities and Maronite and so on. So you're dealing with a European Christian world, which is actually very far from our own British one. Yeah, that's right. And you've also got in Eastern Europe, when we look at a place like Poland, of course, its own distinctive Catholic tradition, which has also hugely influenced modern Europe through Pope John Paul II, which of course is closely linked with nationalism and a nationalism which has grown up out of the conflict between Russia, well, Poland being swallowed up by Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and then a nationalism growing out of that, which has then been accentuated under communism. So I suppose it's also partly national and cultural experiences that we don't know very well.
Does the Eastern Orthodox tradition, do they have any is there any way they influence the culture in terms of worldview, way people think? Because you realise you're meeting different people. We were talking to a professor yesterday at the museum, at the House of European History, and she said that one of the lovely things she's found is being able to go to the East. Now, she's a German living in Belgium, and she's loved to go to the East and meet and to find such commonality.
Yep.
But are there any sort of glaringly obvious differences in the way people think? I have Romanian friends. I'm trying to think. Anything you could bring to bear?
I think personally that the Orthodox world is less attuned than the Protestant one to sort of how do you make, if you like, Christian social thought and Christian activism. It's more of a being than a doing type of spirituality. That's my feeling. And the best of it is there, and also perhaps sometimes the weaknesses of it are there, that it can be perhaps too passive in the face of an hostile, aggressive state.
Is that
but there in our own world where people are often searching for silence, mindfulness, trying to slow down, what is the meaning of life here, and asking deeper questions. I think sometimes the Orthodox writers have rather a lot to say, and people are reading them and finding them very inspiring.
What's been fascinating to us in our journey, because we're not just talking about Hume, we're also looking at life of this Irishman, this Peregrinatio pro Christo, is that a lot of the same, the Desert Fathers, we know that Athanasius, like Evangeline, got into Ireland, and so they're all imitating the Desert Fathers, and yet they're coming from this earthy pagan background, and they're real doers. So you mix this. So when Columbanus sort of gives his kind of curriculum vitae, he says, I want quietness for myself and the salvation of many. So he's got this.
Isn't that terrific?
So what does he do? He keeps traveling and establishing these monasteries that become so formative for preservation of manuscripts and all these missionaries, and yet of course at the same time he's looking for his little hermitage. He's loving his little bit of it, and that's. And maybe we'll never quite marry those two elements. But that's interesting that in the East, you said there is this tendency, and maybe that sort of Neoplatonic dualism. Perhaps,
that's right. I think that is true. I think that's very perceptive. One other thread from Russia, which I think has had considerable influence spiritually in the 20th century, including in Britain and France and so on, is Russian literature. You referred earlier to Dostoevsky, but the world of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and the questions about God and the meaning of life that these writers asked have been absolutely mainstream in European thought in the 20th century. And that's a way, so it's partly through Russian literature and what people sometimes call the Russian intelligentsia that sort of Christian questions have arisen in the rest of Europe.
That's interesting, So that's
on Europe, there's one other quote which I love, which I think I might mention, which is a famous Russian memoirist called Nadezhda Mandelstam, wife of a poet who died under Stalin. Somewhere in her memoirs, she says European culture is based on the symbol of the cross. And I think she's trying to say that there's something about, she's either saying something about Christ's sacrifice stands at the root of European culture in some way, or she is saying that the idea of sacrifice for a higher good and the sacrifice of self is the central thing that makes the dynamic of European culture work.
Yes, that's very interesting. Well, we filmed yesterday in Ghent we were outside. We've seen the Ghent altarpiece, and there's Christ at the centre, the sacrificial lamb on the altar, the Lamb of God, and then you have every tribe, nation, and around. I actually wondered whether the top left load of people coming in with blue were actually the Eastern.
Okay.
But anyway, no one else has interpreted it that way. But I thought this was rather nice. You have all the sort of the red. You can see the popes, but then martyrs mainly. But there are some popes in there. And anyway, it isn't that. But it's interesting that this sort of central figure. I think Chesterton pointed out it was the idea of the Christian knight. His back is really Hector. His back against the walls of Troy as well. It's this idea of the sort of sacrifice. Right. It sort of goes against the grain of kind of the Darwinianist view, but it's a kind of idealism which is so ingrained. Yeah. You wonder whether it exists in the Eastern cultures to the same extent or not, and that's maybe another. I mean, talking Far East, not Christian East, though. But it's a fascinating thought that. So the East, and Russia will never be part of the European Union. Would you?
I don't think it's likely anytime soon. But I think it's partly because Russia is such an unstable country, and I don't think the European Union would wish to risk it. No. Imagine Russia trying to police its borders with South Asia and the Far East, and with its undeveloped, it's not got a developed legal consciousness, Russia. Yeah. And that means that arbitrary rule and corruption easily slip in, and patron-client networks. Yes. Somebody rises and he brings his network, and he falls, and then these traditions are very deep in Russia. Yeah. And they would take a long time to adapt to what actually is a kind of much different culture.
All right. So one of the interesting yesterday in Brussels, one of the things that has caused, and then the female guides often miss this out because they get to the founders of the European Union, they're all men. They don't. But of course, I'd love to talk about the formational women. For example, Schumann's own mother was incredibly influential. His father died when he was 14. So she was always sending him books, suggestions when he was at university. And she's not just a sort of spiritual mentor and a mother. She's an intellectual. So behind this extraordinary human being that looks like a Martian who's just landed in Europe at this time, there's actually a mother who's thinking but we also talk about other women who are involved in the reconciliation process, and you had a few that I've not heard.
Well, I have a few. So we've got, I don't know if you've got anything on Irene Law but Irene Law's visits to Germany, which you've seen in the film, are central to the MRA strategy. So the MRA strategy in the post-war era was travelling teams going to ravaged cities, speakers who had some experience of change in their own lives, like Irene Law, speaking, and then inviting people to local MRA plays, musicals, which present a kind of vision of a different world, and then from that bringing people back to Co. So there was a concept then of travelling teams, speeches, the use of the arts, and the use of conference centres.
It's very
use of hospitality, hospitality, arts, personal sharing. Yeah. And Irene Law was absolutely central to that. But there are, when you start to explore, of course, there are other women who are representing, reaching out to others, of whom Corrie ten Boom is another example.
I'm very moved by her story. Most people have seen the film, I'd have thought, but if you read the book, it's very well written. The Hiding Place.
I've actually not read, or I actually know her but more by story than actually having done the research. I do know that Psalm 32 talks about God as a hiding place, so I'm wondering whether
that's it. You're absolutely right. But there's a point where they're in Ravensbrück, and Betsy's, her sister's dying. Her sister's the one who never compromised. If the Nazis asked her a question, she would never lie. She would never employ falsehood in the service of good. This sort of ploughing with the devil thing. It's very interesting. Whereas her sister was never quite that strong, although, as the writer says, she was large of foot and sensible of shoe, which I just thought was a lovely expression. Anyway, so they're in Ravensbrück, Betsy dies, but as she's dying, she says she has a vision of a place with lots of flowers, a house where people can come for healing after the war. That we're going to need this after the war, she says. We've got, and so Corrie actually establishes that place where people come. And I don't know a lot about it after that, but this is again, it's like Cobra. Of course, there was so many damaged lives, but there was someone else at Ravensbrück who died.
Well, so Mother Maria Skobtsova is one really of that generation of Russian thinkers who end up in emigration with a strong Christian element. Mother Maria Skobtsova, and she's very much at the trying to connect Orthodox emigre circles with social action. You'll find her. There's a book by Father Sergei Hackl about her called Pearl of Great Price.
Oh, lovely.
And she died at Ravensbrück, and the rumor is that she died taking the place of someone else in a lineup to be killed. Somebody who, but I don't think it's ever been proven.
Yeah. But
she's definitely a sort of, I don't know if she's a sort of formally trying to rebuild Europe exactly, because she dies in the war, but she sort of represents that type of spirit.
So we were just picking up on this point. Jacques Delors he in the 90s, often reactionary, says he's a Catholic and he's challenging the EU. If it doesn't find he calls it its soul, a spirit, soul. He's talking religious language, but also that Adenauer, Schumann want to build on what they call a Christian base.
Yeah.
Schumann warns that there must be the spiritual element, otherwise the union itself, the supranational organization, could be a leviathan, I think is the word he uses. Is there something of the essence of Christianity that is almost essential or central to the project that even secular people should acknowledge, even if they don't go the whole way in their acknowledgement of? It is something. Something. Could we talk about that?
Yep. Well, I think that I think it's quite in the framework of biblical thought to feel that societies and nations don't really function well without a spiritual component.
Yeah.
And what does that really mean? I don't think it necessarily means that we have to have a theocratic system, but it does mean that hidden in the depths of every human being, there is a kind of struggle going on between right and wrong and good and evil and different motives. And I think that the Christian perspective is that it's only with the grace of God that our egos are really checked.
Yes.
And without that, somehow we come to identify what is good with our own will, and wills eventually clash.
The divine right
and
kings
conflicts occur, and social conflict will inevitably result without that human capacity to check oneself, which in Christian teaching comes from God.
Yeah.
And from a spiritual place.
Interesting. It's very hard to for Christians to go to a now post-Christian or secular world, because they will immediately point back at the wars of religion, and they will say, well, we're not going there. We want, and so much. I mean, we've talked about the German, French need for Europe. They needed to have this bridge built to avoid, and they really appreciate it. You can see that they, you don't have to go far and meet many French or German people to realise that it's very much in their minds, and they're very worried about the rise of right-wing nationalism and Holocaust deniers, and but yeah. So it's so are there elements of Christianity that feed are very beneficial to democracy generally? We were talking about the Imago Dei, this image of a human being, the worth of a human being, as something equal or bigger than the state itself, because it's more eternal. There's that. So anything? Well, what are the other elements that feed?
Yes, the capacity for service, emphasis on self-sacrifice. I think the other thing is that we all know that this is a point that can be misused, but it's nevertheless a really important point, that we all know that we can, how easy it is to be for our views to be shaped and dominated by the group that we're part of.
Yeah.
And our particular group's viewpoint comes to be right. And I think that that's so deep in the human being that only something coming from God can check your ability to be dominated by the group.
Yes.
And if you like, to be prophetic in a difficult situation is enabled by something which happens at a spiritual level. Now, there are plenty of non-believing prophetic types, and there are also plenty of believers who can exaggerate their points and become bombastic and pompous and so on and so forth. But I think it doesn't invalidate that insight.
I mean, this is so, and I know we must be reaching the end, but I like to, the way I've seen it is I think people need a lever to get out of a vortex of, and it seems to be the lever of Gasperi, Schumann, Adenauer was independently, they were reading Rerum Novarum and Quadrantissimo Anno. Now that has proved, it seems to, along with their deeply held faith, it seems to be a lever by which they are pulling against all the forces around them.
Yes.
Could we talk about Catholic social thought in any its usefulness to?
I feel I'm not well enough trained, if you like, in that tradition to be really informative.
That's fine.
Except that I'm aware of the fact that if you like, that there is a Christian concept of society very much there, and social groups, which it's not sort of I think I probably need to do a bit more reading. Is it Maritain and Co, which I need to kind of
that's right.
brush up on.
I've been told that I mustn't ever publish this book until I've read Maritain properly.
Pabst.
And Pabst is your right.
Okay.
We'll give him
he's very much into that, and also feeding that type of thought into Parliament in different ways.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I think the best place to finish then, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, is service. And because we don't want this to be a cerebral exercise really, we like to think that by highlighting the stories we're doing about these founders, about Columbanus, is to engage people in action. So Schumann saw himself, he called himself a very imperfect instrument of providence. We are all, he said, imperfect instrument. And yet, by his persistence, he managed to will, with his colleague, with this extraordinary union. What's the message? What would be a take-home message from the historian's perspective, for let's do it for Christians first of all. What would be, when we read these extraordinary stories, what would the historian challenge the Christians in the current state, in England, let's say, just in English Christianity, our own? What have you got a?
Well, I'm taken with the phrase the worlds of contemplation and politics are intricately linked, and that what happens in our world of silence and prayer and care for people can and should overlap into the political world, and does overlap, sometimes in direct and ways we can see it, and sometimes in hidden ways that we can't. And that we need to find a way of once again seeing politics and contemplation as something that go together.
That's interesting.
Well, I just pick out two more words. One is about motives. That people I think of non-believing and secular backgrounds. What is it that helps people's motives become purified and something higher than themselves? And it's often a faith perspective.
Right.
And the other thing is that often the best work people do in the world comes out of a sense of vocation. And quite often you'll find that some of the pioneers of interesting, important even global things have some sense of vocation and put it down to a spiritual element.
Right. Sense of calling.
So look at the world of motives. What are the things that what are the things that give people motives that enable them to be of service and to overcome themselves in the best sense?
Yeah.
And what are the things that and how do people find a sense of vocation and calling? And many people want to know the answer to those questions, and often figures of pioneers of fascinating social initiatives often attribute their work to finding a sense of vocation from God.
From God and from God.
And I think the other thing is that Bookman had this emphasis, and I think Christian teachers often do, that we're here in this world for a purpose.
Yeah.
And he wanted to say that, you know, both as individuals we have a purpose, but in some mysterious way humanity collectively has a purpose, and that we find our purpose best when we are embedded in communities who are also thinking along that way.
Yeah.
And of course, his many of these MRA teams, and in other contexts too, it's small groups collectively trying to seek God's will together that makes them most effective.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's a real bulwark against this sort of radical individualism.
Exactly. Very much so. Very much so. Yeah.
That we're dealing with, you know, in all sorts of levels now in the West, and not really having the answers.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's a fascinating thought. So yes, I read a few. I think it was Davison Hunter. He was talking really about it's elites.
Yes.
Our idea. We like the idea of the, you know, who's it? It's that Victorian thinker, the one with the unhappy marriage, lived near us. Ruskin's friend. Anyway, he was one about it was the big man. It was the man, you know, sort of like the Superman almost, who took big days. But actually, it's these networks that I think that's probably a lot of pioneering people. Their frustration is they've never been able to build that network like Bookman managed to do.
And Bookman, of course, was another was that he was hidden in the background of the emergence of the prayer breakfasts as well.
Right.
You know, the person who founded the American prayer breakfast movement.
Right.
Had a key conversation with Bookman once, which set him off.
Yeah.
It was just Bookman had some piece of guidance, which was Christianize what you have. You have something to share.
Yeah.
And this was a businessman who then played a role in the
businessman's breakfast.
So
the EU.
Yeah.
I've not really, and Britain and our leaving and. You know, do you have anything as a historian that's interesting or pertinent to our own situation? Then maybe we could talk about the complexity or the failings of the EU. Has it lived up to the aspirations of the founding fathers, you know, something like that? Just
one thing on the Bookman thing is that Bookman's European work post-war is really an outgrowth of his interwar work. Lots of Oxford Group activity in Germany, in Denmark, in Norway.
Yes.
And it's very easy at times to hone in on a particular episode without understanding that it would not have been possible without decades of work beforehand.
Yes.
On the Britain and Europe, I think that the setting aside the rights and wrongs of Brexit, I think that the British don't always understand how the French and the Germans, for example, may look at the EU, having gone through you know 2 world wars and of course the Franco-Prussian War.
Yeah.
They're not understanding the you know how terrible these events were for Central Europe, and how the EU has been a vehicle for creating a network of new relationships. So I do think that many in Britain are too parochial to understand that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that some of the Brexit perspectives are wrong.
No.
But it's important to appreciate where the EU comes from.
Yeah.
And so that would be one thing. I do think that Europe itself has had and is still in a kind of perhaps it's not the right word, but a kind of culture war between the religious and the secular, which has kind of been running for the last few centuries.
Yes.
And you could say that Europe at its best brings together different streams of ideas from the ancient world, from the Christian world, perhaps from the Enlightenment. But it can easily fall into different silos where it's either religious or secular. And I think that Europe squeezes out the religious at its peril, because I think that at its best, the religious cultures create a vision of service, of sacrifice, of interconnection, of personhood, which gives democracy its life. If without that, it kind of falls into something which is bureaucratic and lifeless.
So, I think we should focus on that just for a minute. There's probably more to say. Jacques Delors says that if Europe does not find a soul in the next decade, the game is up. Schuman warns that without the religious aspect, the EU could become a leviathan.
Yeah.
I think that's the word he used. Why, in particular, are we arguing for Christian exceptionalism in Europe? Is that because we're trying to get back to the heady days of cultural Christianity, or is there something innate in the Christian philosophy, religion, that you've just mentioned a few things about personhood? Could we elaborate on those? Why are these important? Imagine I'm now a heavily secular person. I'm a good person. We don't want your kind of bigoted religion. Why are you trying to tell me that there has to be some exclusivity within Europe? How would this work, or what? Let's do why it's important first. You mentioned a few things. What is innate in Christianity which is so important to democracy in the way we have it?
Well, I think we were broadly operating in the last 500 years in a world where most people were kind of at least formally Christian. That's no longer the case, and I think that the Christian communities need to embrace that it's a different environment.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there. I think we could you could go on.
We could go
maybe you could come up to Cumbria. bring Peter and Laura up to Cumbria, and we'll do swimming in the lakes, and maybe when Dominic's up even from America, it's in July.
Why not? Terrific.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, terrific. Thank you.
And thank your
Exciting
family.
to.
Yeah. Yes, I think so, Thomas. You can. These boys are thinking, as soon as I press that button, we can start travelling north.
I think they are. I think they're probably also thinking.
If you enjoyed this episode, then please show your appreciation with a comment and perhaps even subscribing to the channel. If you have questions, drop them below. And if you want to go deeper into the subject, then please check out the Saving Europe book and the other videos on the channel, especially the Book Distillery podcast, where me and my blue-collar scholar friends go deeper into these very subjects with top academic guests from around the world. So until next time, thanks for watching.